years the famine has been in the land, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. And God sent me before you to preserve the posterity for you in the earth, and to save your lives by a great deliverance. So now it was not you who sent me here, but God, and he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his house, and a ruler throughout all the land of Egypt. Please be seated.
Perhaps one of my favorite things to do in personal Bible study is character studies. And Joseph is a fantastic character study. When we look at the life of Joseph, and as we just read, we see God acting in Joseph's life from beginning to end. We look at his life, and you see everything that befalls him. And what is amazing about the study of Joseph, and as we look closer and we dig deeper into his life and we do that character study, what we find is that outside of his ability to interpret dreams, there is not a single miraculous thing that happens in his life. Not one. You know, we think about all the circumstances that surround him, and we think, obviously something miraculous has to happen, but it's God's providence. God that entire time is working within the laws of nature to bring about his purpose. And so our study tonight is God's purpose in Joseph. We want to study that. Now, if you've ever watched, I think it's it's an animated movie called the Prince of Egypt. And in that movie, as he's in the prison cell, they've cast him into this dungeon in Egypt after the whole deal with Potiphar and Potiphar's wife. He cultivates a tree, and it's growing in the midst of a rock, and that's what this particular picture here is about, to make us think about the hardships that Joseph went through. I want you to think for a moment as we begin our character study here on Joseph and God's purpose in Joseph. Think about his beginning. He was his father's favorite. Now, we hinted in class the other night, on Wednesday night, about that coat of many colors. And oftentimes, as we think about that coat that Jacob would give to Joseph, we think, he gave that to Joseph just because Joseph was his favorite. And while that is part of it, we begin to do a little bit more research, and we look into the Eastern culture and the way that things operated during that particular day and time. And we're in the patriarchal dispensation, the patriarchal age. When Jacob gave Joseph that coat of many colors, he was communicating both to Joseph and to his brethren. Jacob is telling them, when I die, Joseph becomes the patriarch of this family. He becomes the leader. Now, it's already bad enough that he's daddy's favorite, but now he's telling the rest of his older brethren, he is going to rule over you. And so when we look at Joseph's beginning, it's no wonder that his brethren don't want to have much to do with him. Now, if we go to Genesis chapter 37 and verse 3, in that particular passage, what we find here is a description of Joseph. Israel, Jacob, loved Joseph more than all his children because he was the son of his old age. Also, he made him a tunic of many colors. Now, oftentimes we read that verse and we think that the son of his old age, that's talking about Jacob, and he sired Joseph when he was old. That's not, in the context of the Hebrew, that's not who what it's talking about. You ever heard of someone that is young and they have been described as being an old soul? That's Joseph. It's a description of him. Joseph was wise beyond his years. And so when Jacob, when Israel looked at Joseph and he conversed with Joseph and he interacted with this son of his, he realized there was something about Joseph that was different from the rest of his sons. That's why part of the reason Joseph became his favorite, and also part of the reason why Jacob would recognize him as being the next patriarch of the family, the next leader. And of course that caused hatred by his brethren. He was hated more because of his dreams. You continue to read there about Joseph. Joseph has a couple of dreams. And each of those dreams, it is pictured, he is the superior to the rest of his family. In other words, everyone else bows down to him. He has the dream about the sheaves. He has the dream about the stars and himself being, supreme over those things. And so when he tells this dream to his parents and to his brethren, they don't know what to think. Joseph thinks he's better than we are. Joseph thinks he is going to rule over us someday. Finally, they had enough. Joseph is sent to check on his brethren as they are supposed to be taking care of the sheep. They get a hold of him and they cast him into a cistern, this pit that has been dug or carved out of rock to hold water. Apparently, it is mostly empty and it's too deep for Joseph to get out on his own. The brothers decide or are plotting as to what they need to do with him, and most of them want to kill Joseph. Reuben intercedes and says, don't do that. You know what it'll do to our father. And so they don't kill him. But when Reuben has gone off to get lunch or whatever it was that Reuben went to do, the rest of his brothers sell him. The Midianites take him then down into Egypt and they sell him to Potiphar. And so now we see Joseph the slave. In Genesis chapter 39, we have the account there of him going into Potiphar's house. Now, one of the things that we have to remember here is that Joseph is about 17 years old when this occurs. When he's sold into slavery and he ends up in Egypt, 17. But the Bible tells us that as he enters Potiphar's house, it's not long before Potiphar recognizes, much like Jacob did, that there's something different about Joseph. In a manner of speaking, everything that Joseph touches turns to gold. And it's not long before everything that Potiphar has, he's turned over to Joseph and basically told him, you take care of it. Whatever you think needs to be done, you do it. And the Bible tells us there in Genesis chapter 39 that it got to the point where Potiphar didn't even know what he had. He didn't know how wealthy he had become. All that stuff was left in Joseph's hands. Someone else in the household recognized that Joseph was special. And she began to throw herself at Joseph. And as these things occurred, Joseph had resolved within himself not to sin against God. Now, let me ask you this, as we think about Joseph in this character study, how many 17-year-old young men do you know that would have that kind of self-restraint? What does that tell us about Joseph? There's something different about him. Now, she finally catches Joseph in the house, all by himself. Joseph had been, pretty wise not to place himself in her company when there's no one else around, but finally she devises a way to get him in the house by himself. And she lays hands on him and says to him, lie with me. And rather than stick around, the Bible tells us here in Genesis 39:20 all the way through 40 and verse 23 about the story of him becoming a prisoner and the reason for that. He flees from her and leaves his coat in her hand. And so when Potiphar returns home, she finds evidence that Joseph had tried to force himself upon her. What's Potiphar to do? He throws him in prison. Now again, as Joseph has found himself in prison, the jailer, the keeper of the prisons, again, just like Potiphar had, just like Jacob had seen, there's something different about Joseph. And so he leaves the other prisoners in Joseph's charge. He gets certain privileges and such. Even in prison, Joseph's hand was made to prosper. Now, as we continue to look at him or see him in the prison, there are a couple of people that come into prison with him. There's a baker and a butler. As you continue to read there in Genesis chapter 40 and the things that befall Joseph in Genesis 40, the things that are happening here, these two men have a dream. Now, the baker is the one, obviously, that prepares the food of the Pharaoh. And oftentimes we think of a butler as one that cleans a mansion and he opens the door, he waits upon the people of the mansion hand and foot. That is our Western way of looking at a butler. That's not what this man's job was. If you were to be butler to an Eastern king, to the Pharaoh in this instance, you were going to be one of the Pharaoh's or one of the king's most trusted people. And the reason for that were you, as his butler, you were the one that was going to handle his food. Who else would have a better opportunity to kill the king but the butler? You were going to be the one that would taste the food first. You were the one that would take the first drink out of his goblet. All this to make sure that the food wasn't poisoned, to make sure the baker didn't kill the king. You were going to be one of the most trusted people to him. So these two men have dreams. In Genesis chapter 40 and 41, we see this unfolding. Now, as Joseph speaks to the baker, or to the butler first, he lets him know that in 3 days' time you'll be restored. The baker hears this and thinks, that's a deal. What about my dream? His dream wasn't so fortunate, and Joseph let him know that in 3 days' time he would, interpreting his dream, in 3 days' time he would hang. And it happened just the way that Joseph said it would happen. Now, as these things came to pass, remember that Joseph tells the butler, when you get back to Pharaoh, tell him about me. Well, as we are often want to do, someone has done something nice for us and given us hope in the midst of a dark time. When things get good and when things get better, oftentimes we forget the people that gave us a leg up. The butler gets back to his position and he doesn't say a word about Joseph until 2.5 years later. 2.5 years after the butler goes home, Joseph is still rotting in prison. But finally, the Pharaoh has a dream. And nobody can interpret what the dream means. Nobody understands what it is that the dream that Pharaoh had means. And so finally, the butler remembers him. He tells Pharaoh about this man that he had met in prison. And so when Joseph is brought out of prison and he's asked to interpret the dream, Joseph was quick to respond, "It's not me. God is giving this interpretation. It is God that is doing this, that is able to tell us and tell you and show you what it is that this dream means." Now, when Joseph is able to interpret the dream, if you remember the dream of Pharaoh there in Genesis chapter 41, Pharaoh has this dream that out of the river come 7 fat cows, and another part of the dream is 7 fat ears of corn. But as the dream continues, now you have 7 skinny cows that come out and devour the 7 fat cows, and 7 skinny ears of corn that come and devour the 7 fat ears of corn. And Joseph gives the interpretation. What this means, Pharaoh, is that we're going to have 7 years of plenty. You're going to have 7 years where the harvest is more than you're going to be able to use to handle. And so what you need to do is, because what follows this is 7 years of famine, is what you need to do and is take all that you have, all this plenteous years, you gather it up, all that's extra, you put it by in store, and you save up for that 7 years of famine. Because it's going to be hard. It's going to be tough. Now, immediately, it's Joseph that is going to reap the rewards of what God has blessed him with. Now, it's here that we see this tree that is Joseph grow to its full height. The seedling has been growing, and now that tree is going to be able, as we see the tree of life in the Garden of Eden, and now that tree being in heaven and represented in Jesus Christ. Joseph is a type of Christ in this instance. He's going to be able to provide life to all that come to him. You see that type there of Christ. His Egyptian name that is given by Pharaoh means preserver of life. As he has given the interpretation of the dreams, the Pharaoh takes his ring off and he gives it to Joseph and puts him in charge of making sure that what needs to be done is done. He's given a wife, and she is the daughter of a priest, and priests had a very privileged position in Egyptian society. That particular priest was over a city that was dedicated to the worship of the sun. Joseph, as a son-in-law to this priest and as the preserver of life in the kingdom, is given this very privileged position. And so he's put in a position of rulership. Now it's here that we begin to see, finally, as that tree has said, as it's grown, as we said, to full height, we begin to see God's purpose in Joseph. And that's going to bring us now to Genesis chapter 42. I want you to turn over to Genesis 42. And let's look at verses 21 through 24. They have come before Joseph, and Jacob, or Joseph he's kind of giving them a hard time, like brothers do, right? They don't know who he is yet. Beginning in verse 21, they said to one another, "Truly we are guilty concerning our brother, because we saw the distress of his soul when he pleaded with us, yet we would not listen. Therefore this distress has come upon us." Reuben answered them, saying, "Did I not tell you? Do not sin against the boy, and you would not listen. Now comes the reckoning for his blood." What are they talking about? Well, they're talking all the way back, years back, when they had thrown Joseph in the pit, when they'd thrown him in that cistern. And Reuben says, "I told you so. I told you something bad was going to come from this, and it's been a while, but now it's coming to fruition. I told you, don't sin against the lad." The Bible tells us there in verse 24, they did not know that Joseph understood, for there was an interpreter between them, and he turned away from them and wept. Now, if you remember that story, as that continues there in Genesis 42, when they left, Joseph gave the command to fill their bags with grain and then to restore their money in their sack. Now drop down to verse 36. Their father Jacob said to them, "You have bereaved me of my children. Joseph is no more. Simeon is no more." He's in prison. This is what that whole conversation was about there that we just read. Joseph has kept him there with himself. "Simeon is no more, and you would take Benjamin. All these things are against me." He kept Simeon, Joseph did, to ensure that they would bring Benjamin back whenever it was that they came back for more food. Not to mention that they found all their money in their sack, and so now they realize that if we go back, they're going to accuse us of theft. Now, we are blind to so many things. Oftentimes, we're only able to see from our own perspective. The last chapter, though, had not been written in Jacob's life. But Jacob's convinced, Israel is convinced of a lie. And his attitude here shows it. You've taken Joseph from me. You left Simeon behind, and now you're trying to take Benjamin from me. Friends, it's easy to get discouraged in a time of crisis, and it's easy to forget that there may be significant matters at hand that we don't know about. One of my favorite verses in all of Scripture is Romans 8 and verse 28. And we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are called according to His purpose. Things may seem bad, things may be rough, but if we remain faithful to God, what does Paul tell us? All things will work out in the end. Both Reuben and Judah, finally, when hunger sets in, when they can stand it no longer, they're able to get Jacob to let Benjamin go with them. Genesis chapter 43, beginning in verse 11. Now, when they come a second time, they bring Benjamin. Joseph prepares a meal for them at his house. So we're going to pick up in chapter 43, beginning in verse 25. So they prepared the present for Joseph's coming at noon, for they had heard that they were to eat a meal there. And when Joseph came home, they brought into the house to him the present which was in their hand and bowed to the ground before him. One of his dreams here coming to fruition. Pick up in verse 29. As he lifted his eyes and saw his brother Benjamin, his mother's son, he said, "Is this your youngest brother of whom you spoke to me?" And he said, "May God be gracious to you, my son." And Joseph hurried out, for he was deeply stirred over his brother, and he sought a place to weep, and he entered his chamber and wept there. Verse 31, then he washed his face and came out, and he controlled himself and said, "Serve the meal." So they served him by himself, and them by themselves, and the Egyptians who ate with him by themselves, because the Egyptians could not eat bread with Hebrews, for that is loathsome to the Egyptians. Now they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, and the youngest according to his youth, and the men looked at one another in astonishment. Did you catch that? Joseph had sat them in order. How does he know? That's why they're looking at each other, their eyebrows raised. What's going on here? And he took portions to them from his own table, but Benjamin's portion was 5 times as much as any of theirs, so they feasted and drank freely with him. Chapter 44, picking up there in verse 1, now they were seated before him, the firstborn according to his birthright, the youngest according to his youth. The men looked at one another in astonishment. He's giving them all of this stuff. Now when the 11 left early the next morning, Joseph sends his servants after them. He's got another plan. He has put his goblets in their sacks of grain. And so his servants are sent after them. "Why have you repaid evil for good? Is not this the one from which my Lord drinks, and which he indeed uses for divination? You have done wrong in doing this." Now they found that in Benjamin's sack. And Joseph had kind of, or rather Judah had kind of spoken out of turn in that he said, whoever, he denies them stealing anything, whoever sack you find in him, let him die. It was Benjamin. Remember the oath he had taken to his father to bring Benjamin home safely. Verse 16 and 17 now, so Judah, chapter 44. "What can we say to my Lord? What can we speak? And how can we justify ourselves? God has found out the iniquity of your servants. Behold, we are my Lord's slaves, both we and the one in whose possession the cup has been found. But he, Joseph, said, Far be it from me to do this. The man in whose possession the cup has been found, he shall be my slave. But as for you, go up in peace to your father." Judah kind of had a feeling that was going to happen. And so you see what he says in 30 through 34. "Now therefore, when I come to your servant, my father, and the lad is not with us, since his life is bound up in the lad's life, it will come about when he sees that the lad's not with us, he'll die. Thus your servants will bring the gray hair of your servant our father down to Sheol in sorrow. For your servant became surety for the lad to my father, saying, if I do not bring him back to you, then let me bear the blame before my father forever. Now therefore, please, let your servant remain instead of the lad, a slave to my Lord, and let the lad go up with his brothers. For how shall I go up to my father if the lad is not with me, lest I see the evil that would overtake my father? It's at this point, in chapter 45, Joseph can't control himself. Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, have everyone go out from me. So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers, and he wept loudly, so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Let's pick up verses 7 through 9, and then we'll make our points here and God's purpose for Joseph. God sent me before you to preserve life, to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by a great deliverance. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord over his household, and ruler of all the land of Egypt. Hurry and go up to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me. Do not delay. When we look at Joseph's life and we begin to search for God's purpose in Joseph, here's what we see. Sometimes the way out is through a problem. Joseph had struggles, didn't he? He was thrown into a pit, sold into slavery, accused of something he didn't do, and thrown into prison. But he never gave up. We talked this morning about perseverance. Joseph's life is a testament to perseverance, isn't it? Three points here as we think about going through problems. Troubles are going to come, and we can take it for granted sometimes. It's interesting that when the Confederate Army retreated after Gettysburg, General Lee wrote a letter to Jefferson Davis. And in this letter to Davis, he says, we must expect reverses, even defeats. They are sent to teach us wisdom and prudence, to call forth greater energies, and to prevent our falling into greater disasters. It's interesting. Thankfully, in the end, the Union is preserved, but Lee has some wise words here for us, doesn't he? There are going to be times that we get knocked down, is the idea. What's the point? Get up. Get up. It doesn't matter how many times a person falls down. What matters in the end? That he gets up one more time than he falls. Troubles are going to come. Don't take them for granted. Troubles will not last. 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 6, Peter says, in this you greatly rejoice, even though now for a little while, if necessary, you have been distressed by various trials. For a little while, Peter says. We talked about Paul this morning in writing to the Corinthians that this is but a light and temporary affliction. Troubles don't last. They may seem like they're going to last forever while we're in the midst of them. I can only imagine how long days in prison must have been for Joseph, knowing that he's there for being accused of something that he never even came close to doing. But it didn't last. Don't waste the troubles when they come your way. God is able to take our troubles and turn them into good. If you look there at 1 Peter chapter 1 and verse 7, this is what it says. That the proof of your faith, being more precious than gold, which is perishable, even though tested by fire, may be found to result in praise and glory and honor at the revelation or the revealing of Jesus the Christ. Now, as we put away our Bibles, you're ready to sing the invitation song here in just a moment, I want us to think about this. As we think about the life of Joseph and God's purpose in Joseph, it's easy for all of us to get absorbed in our troubles, and we forget that God may be at work in His own time. I can only imagine that as Joseph is sitting there in prison after having interpreted the butler's dream and having told him what was going to happen and giving him hope there as he thinks that Pharaoh is about to end his life at any moment. Thinking every day, the butler's going to tell the Pharaoh about me. The butler's going to tell Pharaoh about me. The butler is going to tell Pharaoh about me. How long do you think before he quit telling himself that? It took 2.5 years. But in God's timing, Joseph came out of that prison. In God's timing, Joseph became a ruler in Egypt. Don't waste the troubles that come our way. It's easy for us to get absorbed in our troubles. We forget that God is working in His own time. We only know what we see and hear. Jacob believed a lie that his son was dead. His guilty brothers never expected to see Joseph again, but God's ways proved true. The dreams that made Joseph's brothers hate him became a reality years and years later. What's the point? God has a plan. And He's working His plan. A plan for blessing and not cursing. And the whole idea behind that is He wants you to follow Him. He wants us to be faithful to Him. Let Him work in our lives on His time. In John chapter 12, I'll leave you with this passage. 32 and 33, we read, "And I, if I be lifted up from the earth, will draw all men to myself." But He was saying this to indicate His death by which He was to die. You see, Jesus suffered death to call you to Himself. Now the question is, will you come to Him? If you have never obeyed the gospel, as we sing the song sometimes, "Oh, why not tonight?" Will you continue to delay, or will you give your life to Jesus? It might be that you're here with us this evening having at one point in time given your life to Jesus. But for whatever reason, you've walked away. As the Father is with the prodigal, He waits you to return. Would you come home and be His again? Friend, if you have a need, if we can help in any way, won't you come while we stand and sing the invitation song?